so that Indigenous students were enrolled in these groups. And so yes, the literature suggests that it's not unique to Australia. What is unique to Australia, however, is the complete lack of research on the matter. There's a little bit in what I found in these articles, but as we'll see later, statistical information on this sort of material in Australia is very silent on the issue. We have a few different reasons for that, one of which is the Racial Discrimination Act of 1975, which actually prohibits the identification of students, of Indigenous students, within special disability groups. So, as a result of this, although an act like that is obviously meant to protect students, when something like this happens, we need actual statistical information on it, and we don't have any information on it. So, it's, as Graham says, this has presented an obstacle to the improvement of educational experiences and outcomes to what she describes as the most vulnerable student group in Australian schools. However, Graham has used statistical evidence from the My School website, which she found very useful, and Department of Education and Training Schools Locator, and her disturbing finds were that Indigenous students faced more than 5 times the risk of being enrolled in emotionally disturbed and behaviourally disturbed schools than non-Indigenous students. The study also talks about the heavily politicised nature of special education and implies that there's an increased requirement that places in special education exist, so that there's an actual conflict between the departments themselves that require more students or want to increase inclusive education and special education settings, and maybe this problem that we have of an overall increase in minority groups within these settings. So she describes it as a hunt for disability in schools, and basically saying that this leads to the dominant culture of Australia being overlooked, and the deficit model of Toomey, where we blame stereotypical views of Aboriginality, is ignoring the impact and the effect of teachers and putting the blame and the burden onto children themselves. So we're ignoring teacher attitudes, classroom context and educational practice. And she also says that this in turn is then perpetuated by the Aboriginal community themselves, who attribute this over-representation in educational settings to a lack of understanding from teachers and of schools, as well as a growing boredom and resentment on the part of their Indigenous students who they feel are not culturally represented or culturally understood. Okay, so that was Linda Graham. Now I'd like to look at Tom Cooper et al. And their article, Young White Teachers' Perceptions of Mathematics Learning of Aboriginal and Non-Aboriginal Students in Remote Communities. And Cooper subscribes to this deficit model of Indigenous learning and goes one step further to say that overall education functions to reproduce social inequalities and that teachers actually have a role in this process. And their paper actually states that not only has education failed to promote equality in Australia, it's actually led to, it's actually widened the gap between black and white Australians by promoting what Cooper describes as a Eurocentric form of education. So if we impose our Eurocentric views on the culture, some people can subscribe to this, but other people are left out. Minority groups, such as Indigenous groups, are actually left out. And this Eurocentric form of education doesn't respect or value Australian Indigenous culture and expects its students to conform to white values in terms of achievement and assessment. So the perceptions held by teachers towards their Aboriginal students was the focus of this study, and found that unfortunately half of the students surveyed held beliefs that still originated from this deficit model. The main deficits that these teachers referred to were the school readiness of Aboriginal students, their lack of adaptive abilities, their level of attendance and transient lifestyle, and also the perception that Indigenous students came to school merely to socialise. So Cooper found that teacher attitudes had improved since a previous study on this subject had been done by Green in 1982 that found that many teachers held the opinion that Aboriginal students had some form of deficiency, inadequate cognitive, social and behavioural skills, and familial difficulties which were the cause of their problems. And that many teachers still identified with this and thought that this was the reason that Aboriginal problems with learning could not be solved by the school. Okay, so now I'd like to probably look at the strongest article that is most critical of the Australian education system and Australian culture in general by Loretta de Plevitz, which is from 2006 and is called Special Schooling for Indigenous Students, a New Form of Racial Discrimination. So de Plevitz is actually saying that Indigenous students are being removed and put in segregated settings, and this is another form of actual just discrimination towards these students, and that and it's systematic or representative of what's been happening since 1788 in regards to Australian removal from Indigenous removal from culture and education, which has been happening for over 200 years. And she calls it the ethos of the Australian education system is responsible for a disproportionate number of Aboriginal students being placed into these settings. So de Plevitz says that the allocation of Australian Indigenous students on the basis of intellectual disability or behaviour disorders is a measure of conformity to the dominant white Australian culture and may in fact actually contravene anti-discrimination laws. She found that the 2004 review of Aboriginal education in New South Wales revealed that Indigenous students are significantly overrepresented in special schools in New South Wales, and that they made up 3.5% of these special education classes instead of instead of making up 3.5% of their special education classes, they actually comprise between 14 to 40% of these classes. So, due to their population size, it should have been 3.5%. So, the figures were basically taken into account to try and allow for this discrepancy. So, the parent submission to this review claimed that cultural differences were the main reason, and that schools didn't have the capacity to appropriately respond to behaviour that was considered acceptable in Indigenous communities. The report then tries to assess why Indigenous students are in different classes and defines two main categories of inclusion into special schools. The student either suffers a disability or they have an emotional behaviour, a behavioural or an emotional disorder. Sorry, I just need some water. Now, the two different types of disability are basically, de Plevitz says that the physical disability is free from cultural bias in its diagnosis. That is a disability such as autism or an intellectual impairment that we can actually be very objective about, and therefore move an Indigenous student into a special education class with reasonable grounds. But she says that on an emotional and a behavioural level, these are subjective constructs, whereas Aboriginal people are being misdiagnosed by professionals, and therefore on these levels, emotional and behavioural, they're actually being put in special education classes at a far disproportionate rate. And all of the literature will agree with this, even the government report that I've got later in the article. So this is where the crux of the issue lies. This is where we look at the ethos of the Australian education system, because it looks quite damning on those grounds that on these levels Aboriginal students are actually being removed from the mainstream and put in segregated settings. So she says that intelligent tests are designed to reflect and reproduce an indication of the dominant paradigm within a culture, And as such, minority groups are significantly misrepresented and misdiagnosed when using these forms of assessment. Her example of a cultural bias in an assessment asks questions such as an intelligence test from a Eurocentric point will ask, who wrote Hamlet? As opposed to, you're out in the bush, you're hungry, you see 3 animals there, which animal should you kill first? If you're hungry and you need to eat in the bush, which an Aboriginal person with knowledge of their own culture and what animals are appropriate to eat within their culture would be able to answer. So based on this New South Wales review, she found that New South Wales Indigenous students were being classified as mild to moderately intellectually impaired at a disproportionate rate in the 12 to 16-year-old population. Severe intellectual disability, which can be, like I said, can be assessed with greater impartiality from a medical point of view, the rates were actually the same. So the report asked whether the role of educators, and like I said, date back to 1788, was responsible for the removal of these Indigenous students from the classroom, based on perceptions of laziness, childlike behaviour and unteachability. The bias of the apparently race-neutral assessment tests, combined with their application by inexperienced and possibly biased operators, may be responsible for removing Aboriginal students from mainstream education. So yes, de Plevitz, 2006. Okay, now I'd like to look at an article called The Minority Report by Sweller et al. And this is The Minority Report, Disproportionate Representation in Australia's Largest Education System by Graham Sweller. And this is a study that is comparing the enrolment in mainstream education with Indigenous students, and Sweller uses another minority group who are also part of the learning difficulties and disorders spectrum language background other than English, LDOTE group, to work out who is actually being accelerated into mainstream classes faster, Indigenous students or migrants and people that don't have English as their first language. And Sweller found that over time there was a disproportionate amount of Aboriginal students, yes, being put into mainstream settings, but relative to the LDOTE group, they were actually being assimilated into mainstream classes at a much faster rate than Indigenous students, and that the rate at which they were being put into special education classes was far lower than the rate of Indigenous students. So this study concurs with Fallen, Anderson and Boyle Graham Cooper that although studies in the US and Europe confirmed the disproportionate representation of minority groups in special education, once again this lack of research and available statistical data was contributing to the problem and further stigmatisation of Indigenous Australians. So this study used school enrolment data published by New South Wales Department of Schools and Communities to prove that yes, these Indigenous students were not being actually accelerated into mainstream settings as much as the language other than English people were. So they said this, once again, that this disproportionate representation of Indigenous boys in New South Wales secondary schools was particularly acute in the subjective categories of disability, and that students who were initially removed for emotional disturbance and behaviour disorders, this subjective area, were actually then being placed in special education settings that were also restrictive settings and becoming attached to juvenile justice areas within juvenile justice. So a transition from an education setting to a juvenile justice setting because of this movement to special education. So the overall findings suggested that there was an urgent need for greater transparency within all education systems in order to publish comprehensive special education enrolment data in order to determine the extent of disproportionality within the Australian education system. Okay, and The final article I'd like to look at was commissioned by the Ministerial Advisory Committee for the South Australian Minister for Education and Children's Services, and it's a report by Debats, and it's entitled Aboriginal Students with Disabilities. This report provides an overview of the major issues related to the education of Aboriginal students with disabilities. So, it agrees that standard assessment instruments for measuring intellectual disabilities are not culturally appropriate for many Aboriginal children. But it states that this may result in the reluctance of professionals to label Aboriginal children as having a disability. So this is a little bit confusing because all the other literature is basically saying that there's an over-representation and Indigenous students are actually being accelerated into these programs, yet this government report is saying that the rates are probably a lot higher and that professionals are reluctant to engage students in these. It does state that the rate of disability in Department of Education and Children's Services schools was more than twice that of non-Aboriginal students in 2002, though. And the reason for this over-representation, according to the government report, are due to the varying social constructs of what a disability is within Aboriginal culture. So it's actually putting the burden on the definition of disability within Aboriginal culture as being the reason why these children, even though aren't being placed in special education settings, even though it's the health professionals who actually make the decision whether to put them in special education settings or not. So I found that a little bit confusing too. And they also agree that statistical data of Indigenous disability is scarce, but like I said, they put this down to something else. They also talk about the prevalence of otitis media and petrol sniffing, brain damage through petrol sniffing as actual reasons why there is why there are more Aboriginal students involved in special education settings. Unfortunately, they alluded this to previously held stereotypical views of Aboriginal culture that people have by saying that, otitis media was caused basically through lack of personal hygiene, and that petrol sniffing, the dysfunction within Aboriginal communities due to petrol sniffing was leading to brain damage, which then was leading to children being placed in special education settings. So the overall subtext to it seemed a little bit racist to me. And they also didn't mention the fact that there was an overrepresentation in emotional and behavioural classes at all. They just completely ignored that in the report and didn't mention anything about the subjective nature of these or allude to any of the actual literature that I've been writing. So I think that maybe this report, if you'd like to look at it in a harsh way, you could say it does conform to what Rosetta de Plevitz actually says is systemic racism, because it presents this rate of disability between Indigenous students and non-Indigenous students as being quite similar. Although it does state that yes, they are similar in these objective categories such as autism and intellectual impairment, but then it just doesn't really say that there is a massive disproportion in the behavioural and emotional disturbance categories. But it does, however, recognise that cultural differences in the perceptions of disabilities and the general distrust of Aboriginal communities towards the schooling system and health professionals need to be understood and adapted to by the Australian Education Department and the Australian culture in general in order to create meaningful interactions between education and health professionals and Aboriginal families. Great, all right, well, in summing up, I'd like to say that yes, the research and literature on the disproportionate representation of Indigenous students in special education settings does suggest that there is an environmental, that based on Toomey's 3 models, that environmental factors may be actually responsible for this phenomenon, and that the deficit model of de Plevitz